think we all have our favorite Bible story. And you may or may not have read the book of Esther before. You know, sometimes we kind of overlook the Old Testament, or we seem to remember the key Old Testament stories, but the story of Esther is a powerful story. It's a story of a young woman who rises to fame. Story of a girl who went from being an orphan to the queen of Persia. And it just so happens she also becomes the person who saves all the Jews from going into extinction. Pretty high calling for someone. The book of Esther is only one of two books that are titled after a woman. The other one's the book of Ruth. And there's no direct pointing to authorship. There was quite a few things that were against the book of Esther becoming in our Bible. There's a certain list that they looked at back in the 300s in the Council of Nicene in 327. They looked at what should be integrated into Scripture and what shouldn't be. And so the book of Esther is one of those books where they said we don't really think we should put it in there. One was they didn't know who wrote it. But obviously the person who wrote it really understood Persia. They understood the palaces. They understood the customs and the laws. And they understood what was going on. And it's a great story. And also the person that wrote it really liked saying the name Esther, because of all the women in the Bible, the name Esther is given the most time, 55 times, just in the book of Esther. And so the second closest is Sarah, and she was mentioned 51 times. Another thing about the book of Esther, it has the longest verse in the Bible. We'll get to that as we go forward, but it's one of the other things it's known for. But it's also never uses the name God, and that was one of the reasons they said, you know, we should not put it in because there's no direct reference to God at all. But it does show us a woman who has faith, a woman who trusts in God, and a woman who is used by God. We see certainly God's providence. We see God's hand all over Esther and how he chooses to use her. And even though God's not named, we see his hand behind her. And so we're grateful that the book of Esther was indeed included, because it shows us someone who has just incredible faith. And so we're going to look at chapter 1 this morning and get the background for the book of Esther. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1 says this. This is what happened during the times of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. And at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. It tells us quite a bit in those two verses. It tells us that he's the king at this time of the Persian Empire. And that there's 127 provinces that he's trying to maintain. Now, what blows my mind is, you know, we've got 50 states. And we think about how Washington, D.C. has to govern those 50 states. And you think about all the technology we have, from satellite phones and internet and cell phones and all that. And you know, remember with things like Katrina, where it knocks out power and it's hard for everybody to figure out what's going on. That happens today. Can you imagine trying to keep up with a kingdom back then, before cell phones, before internet, before walkie-talkies or anything, and they're trying to maintain an empire of 127 provinces that went from Cush to India. Now you may remember where India is. You may not be familiar with Cush. Cush is the old name for Ethiopia. I've got a map for you, just in case you want to know. That darker yellow, that's the Persian Empire and the time of Esther. You can see that's a lot of land. It's a lot of real estate to maintain. And so he was doing that. And in order to do that well, he decides in verse 3 that he's going to invite everyone to come to the palace for a banquet. So it says in verse 3, and in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials and military leaders of Persia and Media, and the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. So in order to have influence and in order to kind of show off, he invited everybody to his palace in Susa. He kind of wanted to meet them and then to meet him and to show off that this is a great empire to be a part of. I guess it was kind of a PR thing, saying you don't really want to revolt, you don't want to cause trouble because things are good here. And so he was doing that, and they decided that they would have this great big banquet or a festival. It tells us a bit more about it in verses 4 and 5. It says, for a full 180 days, 6 months, 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. And when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in an enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. At the time of the Persian Empire, the king had 3 capital cities. Susa was just one of them, but it was the most spectacular. It was the largest, it was his winter palace, and so he invited everyone to come there, and he showed off for 180 days, and then they had this great big feast. And it goes on in that first chapter, talk about the hangings and the statues and the marble and all the colors and how just beautiful this palace was. And then one of the things it says that each person who attended the party had their own personal goblet that was handcrafted out of pure gold, and each one was unique. You know, that's always handy. Today, we get those little cups, and you just take a Sharpie and write your name on it. Well, that way, if you left your golden goblet to go somewhere, you'd say, well, that one's mine. But there could have been 1,000 of these golden goblets that were hand-fashioned. And another thing that it says is that the wine was freely flowing. They never wanted your golden goblet to be empty. They were showing off their wine, their splendor that they had there at the Capitol. Now you may say, that's pretty impressive, but if that's not enough for you, verse 9 tells us that Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of the king Xerxes. She had her own party. At the same time the king has his party. And so here at a separate place, she was showing off for all the women. And then, you know, what typically happens a lot when there's excessive drinking, then there's excessive poor judgment. And so that part of our story comes into play. And so here we got this wine flowing freely, and they start to make some poor decisions. In verses 11 and 12 it says this, he says, the king said to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown. I will mention he wanted her to wear only her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come, and then the king became furious and burned with anger. So the king sent 7 of his officials to go get the queen and says, we'd like you to come to the king's party, and we want you to wear your crown and your birthday suit. And the queen said, I don't really think so. She may have been drinking her party, but she wasn't drinking that much. She said, I don't think that's a good idea. I would rather not. Now, he's the king. You don't refuse the king. Even the queen is not supposed to refuse the king. So, we've got an issue. And so you can imagine the scene. Here the king with all his guys, and they're excited. She's coming out. They're ready. Come on. Bring out the queen. We're ready to see her. And then the nobles come back in and they say, oh, got a small problem. And the king says, well, tell me what's wrong. He says, she refuses to come out. What? And he blows his head gasket. He is embarrassed. He loses his temper. He is mad. And it seems like that whenever there's one bad decision, it seems like it often leads to other bad decisions, doesn't it? The problem is the king consults with his drunken friends on what to do next. Now let me just take a little parenthesis there. When you're in a jam, be careful where you get your counsel from. Because if you want someone to confirm your bad judgment, there's always a stupid person willing to give you their opinion. Amen. But if you're wanting a right, good, godly choice, you need to consult right, godly people. And so the king is really defaulted to bad decision making because he's got bad friends around him. And one of his advisors, by the name of Meocan, says this is what we should do in verse 17. He says, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women. And so they will despise their husband to say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she would not come. Now this is the premise that he's come up with. If we don't do something, then all the women in the Persian Empire are going to find this out, and they're going to rise up, and none of these women are going to obey their husbands anymore. And we're going to have tyranny in our hands. There's going to be a mass uprising. They're not going to make biscuits in the morning. They're not going to clean clothes anymore. They're not going to do anything, all because the queen refused to come out in her birthday suit. And so we've got a problem. We've got a big problem. What are we going to do? And so they realize that this could be the whole crux that destroys the Persian Empire. This is huge. So what are we going to do? Here's what they decide to do in verses 19 and 20. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Mede, that which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the king's presence of King Xerxes. And also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. And then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. So that's the plan. What they're saying is if we make an example out of Vashti, those women who are inspired to take up and disobey will also see the consequences of being disobedient. And so we'll just, as Barney Fife used to say, we're just going to nip it in the bud. And so that's what they do. She is no longer queen. Most likely, King Xerxes divorced her. Now, he did allow her to stay in the palace. She could remain in the harem. He didn't kick her out on the street. But let's just be honest. Can you imagine how those women in the harem treated her? A disposed queen? I don't think it was pretty. I think she probably would have preferred to be living out on the streets than to deal with that harassment. But I guess that was his being nice to her by letting her stay. And so, and then it says that decree for all women to know their place in the Persian Empire was put in every language that was known in the empire and was sent out. So the men could sleep well at night knowing that the women would not uprise. Now, according to this chapter, it tells us that Persian law, that no law, royal decree could ever be changed. The king himself did not even have the power to alter his own laws. So he had to live with the consequences. This is important for us to learn because it's going to come and play in the book of Esther later on. So once the king makes a rule, he can't say, I don't know what I was thinking. You know, I think I might have been drinking last night when I made that rule. Not a good rule. Want to change that rule. He can't do it. Once it's made, it's made. And boy, aren't you glad that's not true for us? You know, it's great when you can just say, oop, stupid call, that was bad, messed up. And so you might want to wonder, you know, why is this important? Why does chapter 1 start here? Why doesn't it start with Queen Esther? Why do we have all this background? Well, this background sets the door. We're looking for a new queen. Vashti's disposed, new queen, new woman. But you also may be wondering, this is a great history lesson, learn some things about the Persian Empire, but what does it have to do with me? I think there's two things we can pull from today. Number one is no one lives independently of God. All right? No one lives independently of God. If we could have been a reporter back then at the party and interviewed King Xerxes and Queen Vashti and the officials of the court, and we would have asked them, what is your relationship with God and what's your responsibility to Him? They would have laughed at us. Because they didn't worship God. They didn't believe in God. They would have mocked us. They were not God-fearing, God-worshiping people. The only gods that they ever chose to admit into their life were those gods that satisfied their basic needs in life. They were fulfilling their physical wants and desires. That's what they were doing. And so, if you've read the book of Esther, you understand that it's going to unfold that God's at work in this. Even in chapter 1, God's at work in this. No one can live independently of God. Even those people who say, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. Even those people are dependent upon God. It would be similar for us to say, I'm going to boycott air. I'm against air. I don't like air. I've heard bad things about air. I can't see air. I can't touch air. I can't feel it. I'm just going to go air-free from now on. And you can put yourself in an air-free environment for about this long. You got to have it. And you can say, I want to be God-free, independent-free. I don't want God to have any influence in my life. I don't believe He exists. I don't think He's there. I can't touch Him, can't feel Him. I don't want Him. But you're dependent upon God whether you like it or not. The amazing thing is even Christians get to that point where they say, I don't really want to be dependent upon God all the time. That we have these lofty ideas that we're all that and we don't need Him, but we do. The psalmist said it this way in Psalm 139. He said, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for the darkness is its light to you. Like it or not, we cannot live independently of God. Even Christians are sometimes tempted to live independently of God. Sometimes we get mad at God. Don't deny it. I've been there. You've been there. You're praying, you shake your fist, you're saying, why? Why is this happening? It's not fair. Maybe it didn't unfold the way you wanted to. Maybe you thought it would have a happier ending. Maybe you didn't think God would let something like this happen to you, and we shake our fist. Sometimes, even in our own mind, we think, if I could just do it the way I think it ought to be done, I think it would be a lot better. Why do we think we know more than He does? But we cannot choose to live our lives independently from God. Psalm 16:11 says, you make known to me the path of life. You will fill my joy in your presence with eternal pleasures at your right hand. If we would choose to follow Him, He has a perfect path set before us. Here's number 2. God does not need your cooperation to accomplish His will. Now, this is going to be a news flash for some of you, okay? So, bear with me, but God does not say, well, if Mike Klein doesn't go with this plan, I don't know what we're going to do. Angels, we're going to have a meeting. We have got to find a way to get Mike on board. If not, the whole thing's just going to fall apart. Sorry, Mike, but you're just not that important. There is no way we're going to unravel God's purposes and plans and ways. We're not that key of a player. And God has always been at work through the ages to bring glory to himself, and he will always, always, always get the glory whether you cooperate or not. If you're going to be a stump, he will plow around. He will always accomplish his purposes, his plans, and his ways, whether you're going to cooperate with him or not. Now, God created humanity for his glory. And God works in our lives to get the glory, just as he worked in the lives of Vashti and King Xerxes. God was there. And he was working behind the scenes, preparing a king and a kingdom, because he knew in his foresight that a new queen, a Jewish queen, had to get on the picture to save his people from disaster. God has perfect foresight for what's going to happen. And therefore, God knows how to accomplish his plans and his purposes, and he knows how to get to the end of the story. I want to turn to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. It says, "In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will." Now, I want to just drive off the side of the road for a minute and talk about this verse. Okay? I think it's important. And I think in order for us to get the full benefit, I don't want to lose any of you. So hang with me, because the key word that jumps out at us at this verse is the word predestined, isn't it? And we really want to know, what does that mean? And I think there's a lot of people that take that word predestined and they cause it to mean something that sounds like God's taken away my free will and my right to choose. And when we hear that, we kind of rise up and we think, how can he do that? How can he just turn me into a kind of a puppet and just make things happen? Well, let me say this. Our doctrinal framework has to fit together perfectly. And so when we have one doctrinal statement and two doctrinal statements, they've got to fit cohesively. I want to give you three key doctrinal words here, okay? The first one is that the Bible tells us, even before God said, "Let there be light," he knew your name. Now, we don't have a problem with that. We say, well, there's nothing wrong with God knowing my name before he said, "Let there be light." But let me tell you, also before he said, "Let there be light," he knew every choice you were going to make. He knew every triumph you're going to have in your life. He knew every bad decision. He knew every mistake. He knew everything you were going to do before he said, "Let there be light." The big word, he's omniscient. He knows everything. Well, now you're thinking, well, that's a lot to know. And you know, why isn't he taking away my free will if he knows all the choices I'm going to make? Well, let me tell you the next word. The next word is sovereignty. And sovereignty, the definition is the authority of a state to govern itself. This means that God places self-imposed limitations on himself. That's what sovereignty means. Now, I'm old enough, I remember, and some of you do too, when you rented a U-Haul truck and they had governors on the truck. Now, let me tell you what that meant. The law was 55. We were in a gas crisis. And so I don't care if you stood on the accelerator and had a bag of rocks on it, it would not go over 55 miles an hour. I don't care if you were going downhill. I don't care if somebody was chasing you. You could not get that truck to go over 55 miles an hour. Had nothing to do with the amount of power the motor was producing. It had everything to do with the governor was limiting the amount of power coming out of that truck so you would not exceed 55 miles an hour. God says in His sovereign will, I know all things, but I'm not going to act upon all things. Let me add the third word. He's omnipotent, which means God has all the power at His disposal to do anything He wants to do. But because He's sovereign, He's going to limit what He's going to do with His power and His knowledge. So this means God's sovereignty is going to say, I am not going to violate your free will. I am not going to step over that line. You know, there's a great verse in the book of Revelation chapter 3 that talks about it. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. That verse is God being sovereign. It could say, I'm going to come to your door and break it down and sup with you, King James. So it's not one of those slang terms. What's up? Sup with you. But he says, no, I'm going to be a respecter of your will. Knock on the door. You've got to open the door. You've got to invite me in, and then we can have dinner together. God is not going to violate His sovereign will. He's not going to abuse His power nor His knowledge to violate your free will. Now, where does this all mix together? Let me tell you. You come down here. This is what God wants out of our relationship with Him. This is what He desires. He wants what we want to be what He wants. Now you see how that would make perfect sense? If we would simply do what God's will is, then God can accomplish His purposes and His plans. And you and I each hold the key of saying, am I willing to do what God wants, or am I not? Now you remember with the life of Jesus, throughout the Gospels, you hear this one phrase time and time again. I've got it here from the book of Luke. Jesus says, not my will, but your will. How many times did Jesus say that? In the garden, Father, if there's any way, if you're willing, anyway, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will. That needs to be where we're at. Can you imagine what Christianity, what the world would be like, what the people coming to Christ would be like if every Christian was sincere and genuine in saying, Lord, your will be done. According to Google, there's 2.2 billion Christians in the world today. Can you imagine what would happen if 2.2 billion Christians said, yes, Lord, to everything God said? Can you imagine how radical this world would be? 2.2 billion Christians. Now, unfortunately for you, I'm not preaching to 2.2 billion people. I'm preaching to you. And so the result is, what are you going to do with today's message? Are you willing to say, not my will, but your will? Are you willing to say, I want to help God accomplish His purposes and plans? I don't want to work against Him. I want to work with Him. Now realize He will accomplish it with you or without you. But oh, how much sweeter it is to work with Him.
Amen.
So we're at time of invitation. Time of invitation is very simple. One, if you're not a Christian, then a lot of what I said today makes very little sense. But God has a plan for your life. He knew that before He said, let there be light. And He desires so much to bring a relationship with you. Secondly, if you are a Christian, God knows where you butt heads. He knows where you defy Him. He knows where you're not willing to let go, where pride rises up and self says no. He also knows He loves you so much He's willing to give you grace to keep trying time after time. Would you just say, Lord, I'm tired of fighting you. I just want to do it your way. Third, if you don't have a Christian church home, good news is we're still receiving. We haven't put a no vacancy sign on the door yet. So we're still open. But pray through those. Sing as we have our time of